If you live in a major American city, I want you to grab a mental snapshot of the kids playing in your local neighborhood park.
Just, picture the playground for a second.
Right. Because statistically speaking, over a third of those kids will experience an investigation by Child Protective Services before they turn 18.
Yeah.
Not a fraction of a percent, over a third.
It's a statistic that, honestly, it usually stops people right in their tracks.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we have this, culturally ingrained assumption that state intervention in a family is this really rare fringe event.
Like a last resort.
Right, like a final safety net that only drops down in the most extreme, obvious emergencies. But the data tells a completely different story.
Which is exactly why you and I are here today. So welcome to this deep dive, everyone.
Glad to be here.
Our mission today is to explore what you might call the long, invisible shadow of childhood maltreatment. We're going to look at exactly who the child welfare system investigates, how it actually intervenes or, fails to intervene.
Which happens a lot.
Yeah, and the surprising biological and educational impacts that follow these kids deep into their 30s and 40s.
And we are anchoring this whole exploration in some incredibly robust research today. The foundation of our discussion is led by a Duke Population Research Institute scholar, Christopher Wildeman.
And for you listening, that is pronounced Wildeman, just to be precise.
Right, Wildeman.
And to set the stage for you, our initial hook into this entire landscape comes from a foundational article published in PNAS.
Yeah, that was a major one.
It really was. This research shows that contact with the child welfare system is just radically unequally distributed across the population.
Highly unequal.
So understanding the long-term health consequences of childhood adversity and this massive state involvement in family life, it basically sheds some crucial light on population-level health inequalities.
From there, we'll be looking at two subsequent articles, both of which were supported by pilot funding from the Duke Population Research Center.
Right.
And those specifically zero in on the long-term health consequences of childhood maltreatment.
I am so eager to see how these different threads weave together. I mean, how does systemic inequality, a knock on the door from a social worker when you're 8, and your physical health when you're 40 all connect?
It's a complex web.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can understand the health impacts of the child welfare system, we first need to understand the landscape of who actually interacts with it.
Yeah, the baseline reality.
Exactly. And frankly, I just didn't realize how pervasive this was.
Oh, it is entirely pervasive. The PNAS study looked specifically at the 20 largest U.S. counties to map out the reality of Child Protective Services, or CPS.
Okay.
And they found that the median investigation rate across these large counties is 34.5%.
Okay, so just to be crystal clear here, in the average major county, more than 1 in 3 kids will have a social worker investigate their home life before they graduate high school.
Exactly. 1 in 3. But it's vital to understand this 34.5%, well, it's just a median.
Right.
The risk isn't shared equally at all. The racial disparities are profound, with Black children facing the highest risks across the board.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
Well, for example, in King County, Washington, the risk of a CPS investigation for a Black child is 32.9%.
Oh.
But if you look at Maricopa County, Arizona, that number skyrockets to an astonishing 63.3%.
Wait, over 63%?
Yeah.
So for a Black child growing up in that specific county, a CPS investigation isn't just a possibility, it is the modal outcome.
It's the norm.
It is literally more likely to happen than not. That is wild.
Precisely. And the variation, it isn't just about who gets investigated.
Yeah.
It becomes even more fractured when you look at what the state does after an investigation.
Like the interventions.
Right. When we look at late-stage interventions, specifically the termination of parental rights, or TPR.
Which is when they legally sever a child from their parents forever.
Right. Yes, permanently. The county-to-county differences there are completely radical. In places like New York, and Cook County, Illinois, the TPR rate is about 0.2%.
Okay.
But back in Maricopa County, Arizona, the rate for Black children goes up to 5.6%.
That is nearly 30 times higher.
Yeah, it's a massive gap.
It's like playing a high-stakes postcode lottery. I mean, imagine if we enforced traffic laws like this.
Right.
Like in one town, speeding gets you a polite warning, but you cross the county line and going 5 miles over the limit gets your car permanently impounded and crushed.
That's a really good analogy.
It just really makes you wonder if we even have a unified national child welfare system at all, or if a child's entire fate is just dictated entirely by their zip code and their race.
This raises an important question. What this data impartially proves is that state intervention is ubiquitous, yet it's radically inconsistent.
Yeah.
The threshold for what justifies breaking up a family, well, it changes entirely depending on where you stand on the map.
Which is terrifying.
Yeah. But whether a child is investigated, ignored, or removed from their home, the trauma surrounding these events doesn't just evaporate when they turn 18. It echoes.
Which naturally leads us to ask, what happens to the physical bodies of these kids decades later?
Exactly.
If you are swept up in this inconsistent system, or if you are suffering from maltreatment, how does that early trauma physically manifest when you reach midlife?
So to understand that, the researchers utilize the AdHealth dataset.
Okay.
It's an incredibly rich, nationally representative longitudinal study. This allowed them to look at adults approaching midlife, specifically ages 32 to 42.
Oh, wow. So really looking long term.
Yeah, and what they found is that by their 30s and 40s, the cumulative physiological consequences of early trauma really start to present themselves.
So we aren't just talking about general stress here. The researchers were able to link specific types of childhood maltreatment to specific midlife health risks.
Yes, very specific pathways.
Like the data shows that experiencing physical neglect in childhood is heavily associated with midlife smoking. Right?
Why is that? I mean, why would a neglected 7-year-old inevitably become a 40-year-old smoker?
It comes down to a mix of physiological and environmental mechanisms. When a child experiences severe physical neglect, they're often deprived of a regulated, supportive environment.
Okay, that makes sense.
And this can lead to early adoption of self-soothing behaviors to cope with that chronic stress. Nicotine is a powerful, accessible chemical that artificially regulates dopamine and stress in the brain.
Ah, I see.
So combine that neurobiological craving for regulation with a lack of parental supervision in adolescence, and you create a heavily reinforced pathway right to midlife smoking.
That makes a lot of sense. The body is literally hunting for the chemical regulation it didn't get from a stable environment.
Precisely.
The data also showed a very specific link between childhood sexual abuse and midlife clinical depression.
Yes. And the mechanism there is deeply tied to how trauma rewires the nervous system itself.
Well, severe early trauma, like sexual abuse, can leave the body in a state of chronic hypervigilance. The brain's stress response system, the HPA axis, it basically gets flooded with cortisol so often that its baseline gets permanently altered.
Oh, wow. So it's a physical change.
Completely. And decades later, that chronic dysregulation frequently manifests as clinical depression.
And then the study looks at what happens when these traumas compound, right?
Yeah, the multi-victimization.
Right. When a child experiences more than one type of abuse or neglect, and the risks just elevate everywhere. You see higher rates of poor general health, obesity, and an elevated risk for cardiovascular disease.
What's fascinating here is how the body keeps a cumulative score. But the researchers wanted to know how it keeps that score.
Right. Does every single traumatic event directly equal a specific increment of disease?
Exactly.
And here's where it gets really interesting. You read these outcomes, and you might assume that human trauma works like a poison meter in a video game.
Oh, like a health bar taking damage.
Exactly. Like every single additional act of abuse adds another drop of poison, ticking up your health risks in a perfectly straight mathematical line.
Right, a linear progression.
Yeah, like one trauma equals 10% risk, two traumas equals 20%. But the study specifically tested for that, and they found absolutely no linear dose-response relationship.
None at all.
Why isn't human trauma a simple math equation?
It's a brilliant question, because a perfectly linear graph is what you might naturally expect. But human biology is far more complex.
Obviously.
The researchers adjusted for other adverse childhood experiences, like parental incarceration or extreme poverty. And when they did, that straight step-by-step line disappeared.
Oh, interesting.
Now, to be clear, frequency still matters immensely. Children who suffered frequent maltreatment, meaning 6 or more instances, they had much higher risks for midlife obesity and depression than those who suffered infrequently.
Okay, so frequency is bad.
Very. But it's not a 1-to-1 ratio.
So, getting abused 6 times is worse than once, but the third time isn't mathematically worse than the second time in a perfectly predictable way.
Exactly. And the lack of a perfectly linear dose response, well, it highlights 2 major realities about human beings.
Which are?
First, biological thresholds. The nervous system has a concept called allostasis,
Hmm.
the ability to maintain stability through change.
Okay.
The body can absorb a certain amount of stress up to a critical threshold before its adaptive capacities just snap.
Oh, I see. It holds on until it can't.
Right. And second, it highlights human resilience and the really powerful buffering effects of social support.
Like having someone in your corner.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sometimes an isolated traumatic event can be buffered if a child has a strong, loving grandparent or really dedicated teacher. That external support can disrupt that straight line of accumulating biological damage.
Okay, so we've established that the child welfare system is vastly unequal across the country. And we know the biological stakes. Childhood trauma, especially frequent multi-victimization, physically alters your brain and body, leading to severe midlife health crises.
Definitely.
So if we know how devastating the trauma is, does the state actually step in when the maltreatment is at its absolute worst?
You would logically assume so. I mean, the core premise of Child Protective Services is to protect children in the most danger.
Right.
But to answer this, researchers applied a statistical method called latent class analysis to the data, which grouped the children into 4 distinct patterns based on the reality of what they actually experienced.
Okay, hold on. Latent class analysis. That sounds a bit like textbook jargon.
It does, yeah.
Can you explain that in plain English for us? Like, how does it actually group these kids?
Of course. Think of it like a smart algorithm on a music streaming app.
Okay.
The app doesn't ask you what your favorite genre is.
Mm.
Instead, it looks at millions of invisible data points. You know, what the songs you skip, what tempo you prefer, what time of day you listen.
You're right. It tracks your behavior.
Exactly. Then it naturally clusters you into a specific class of listeners with people who behave exactly like you, even if you don't neatly fit into a predefined category like rock or jazz.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. So latent class analysis does this with data. It looks at the massive, messy pile of survey data regarding childhood experiences, and without any preconceived bias, it naturally sorts the children into distinct behavioral clusters or classes based on hidden similarities in their trauma and state interventions.
That makes perfect sense. It finds the invisible patterns in the noise.
Exactly.
So what did this sorting algorithm reveal about the children?
It revealed a massive disconnect. We really need to focus on the stark contrast between 2 specific groups, Class 3 and Class 4. Let's start with Class 3, which makes up about 8% of the sample.
And what defines Class 3?
These children experience recurring, frequent, severe multi-victimization.
Okay.
They report incredibly high rates of physical abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, and supervisory neglect. It is the most intense concentration of trauma in the entire data set.
The absolute worst case scenarios.
Yes.
So I imagine the state is intervening heavily here.
No, that is the jarring part.
Wait, really?
Yeah. This group has an extremely low rate of foster care placement. Very few of these children are ever removed from their homes.
That's wow.
Demographically, these children are predominantly from families with low socioeconomic status, and they are racially diverse. They're suffering the most, yet they are largely left in those environments.
Okay, that is deeply unsettling.
It is.
But you mentioned a contrast with Class 4. How does the algorithm define them?
So Class 4 is much smaller, making up about 2% of the sample. These children experience relatively infrequent maltreatment.
Infrequent.
Yes. Their exposure to abuse and neglect is much lower, but their foster care placement rate is extraordinarily HIGH.
Wait.
In fact, it is over twice as high as any other class in the entire study.
Wait, let me make sure I have this straight. They experience less abuse, but they are removed from their homes at double the rate of anyone else who makes up this group.
Demographically, this group is disproportionately Black, making up 32.7% of the class, and overwhelmingly male at 75.2%.
So we have an undeniable contradiction here.
A huge one.
It's like, imagine a hospital emergency room where a patient walks in with a tiny paper cut and the doctors admit them for major invasive surgery.
All right.
Meanwhile, a patient arrives with 2 shattered legs and internal bleeding, and the hospital just hands them an aspirin and sends them home.
It really is like that.
It's like a home security system that completely ignores a burglar actively smashing a window, but triggers a massive SWAT response because a delivery driver dropped off a package on the porch.
Does this imply the system is measuring something entirely distinct from actual child safety?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look impartially at what the data exposes.
Right.
As analysts, we are simply reporting the facts here, not taking a political side on the nature of state institutions. But the facts expose a systemic discordance.
Yeah, that's clear. The system's interventions are not directly tracking with the objective severity or frequency of the abuse. Marginalized groups, specifically black males, face highly punitive family separation despite lower maltreatment frequency.
Unbelievable.
And currently, a massive swath of severely abused, impoverished children of various racial backgrounds are effectively being ignored by the state.
It makes you wonder if the mechanisms that trigger an investigation, like mandatory reporting in schools or hospitals, are subject to implicit biases,
Oh, almost certainly.
or if bureaucratic blind spots just cause the system to totally misjudge who is actually in danger.
There are a lot of factors at play.
But regardless of the why, we have to ask about the aftermath. So what does this all mean? We have two groups of kids on opposite sides of this mismatch.
Right.
What happens to the severely abused kids left at home in Class 3 versus the less abused kids who were removed from their homes and put in foster care in Class 4?
The adulthood consequences for these two groups are remarkably divergent, and they highlight the distinct impacts of state action versus state inaction.
Okay, let's hear it.
For Class 3, the children left in their homes to endure severe, recurring trauma without intervention, they report significantly worse overall physical health in early adulthood.
Because they were just left in the fire.
Exactly.
The chronic stress, the physical damage, the lack of medical care, their biological bodies simply bear the toll of the maltreatment the state ignored.
Precisely. Their physical health deteriorates. But then we look at Class 4.
The kids placed in foster care.
Yes. These children didn't suffer the same severe physical trauma at home. But because they experienced the profound disruption of foster care, they suffer severe educational penalties.
How does that mechanism work? Why does foster care directly torpedo a child's education?
It comes down to systemic instability. When the state removes a child, they often change homes multiple times.
Right.
Every time a home changes, the school usually changes. Credits don't transfer properly. Essential social ties with supportive teachers or peers are severed.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. The baseline stability required to learn is completely shattered. As a result, the data shows that children in Class 4 have much higher rates of school expulsion and high school dropout compared to the other groups.
For you listening, think about the tragic irony here.
Yeah.
The system's absence allows a child's physical health to permanently fail, as we see with Class 3.
Right.
But the system's aggressive presence, the very act of putting a child into foster care for protection, as we see with Class 4, frequently shatters their educational and social trajectory.
It's a double-edged sword.
It feels like whether the state ignores you or polices you, the child loses.
And unfortunately, the data points to a shared tragedy at the end of both of these divergent paths.
Which is?
Despite their different experiences, one ignored, one heavily intervened upon both Class 3 and Class 4 face a significantly higher probability of adult criminal justice contact.
Like arrests and convictions.
Yes, meaning arrests and convictions, compared to children who experience no maltreatment.
Wow, it's just a pipeline.
A very clear one, sadly.
Let's briefly distill this incredible journey we've been on because there's just a lot for us to chew on here.
For sure.
We started with Christopher Wildeman's foundational research, realizing just how massive and radically unequal CPS investigations are depending on what zip code you live in.
Right. From there, we explored the biological reality that early trauma and multi-victimization don't just fade away with time.
They really don't.
They physically alter the nervous system, manifesting as smoking, clinical depression, and cardiovascular disease by midlife.
And finally, we uncovered that jarring mismatch in the system.
The latent class analysis.
Yeah. The state's response is often entirely disconnected from the actual severity of the trauma. The kids suffering the worst abuse are frequently ignored, destroying their physical health, while kids with less trauma are aggressively removed from their homes, derailing their education.
It basically proves that our culturally ingrained assumption that the state acts as a perfect uniform shield is simply not supported by the population-level data.
Not at all. So I want to leave you with a thought to ponder as you go about your day. We've seen the data.
We have.
If the state's ultimate intervention, removing a child and placing them in foster care, is sometimes as destabilizing to a child's educational and social future as the maltreatment itself, what would a radically reimagined system look like?
That's the real question.
Could there be a system that actually heals families at the root of their poverty or their trauma, rather than forcing society into this false choice between policing them with family separation or ignoring their suffering entirely?
It's the exact question that this data demands we ask ourselves.
We all want to believe in a clean, reliable system that perfectly diagnoses a problem and knows exactly how to fix it. We clearly aren't there yet.
Far from it.
But understanding these murky waters and looking honestly at the numbers is the first step to clearing them. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.